that's no accident. That experience of liturgical whiplash, I think in some ways parallels what those first disciples must have gone through. Of having such great hopes that Jesus would ride in on that colt, would be heralded as the king that would come to liberate the people of Israel from the oppressive hands of the Roman Empire. That he would ascend to the throne and that the people would be set free. What they got looked very different. I think it's important that on this Palm Sunday we read these words of Jesus' passion, of his last moments, of the experience of being arrested, tried in a sham trial, tortured, beaten, and hung up on the cross. It's an incredibly violent episode at the heart of our faith. But I think that violence is in some ways key to understanding what the significance of the cross is. Jesus lived in a violent age. He was born into the land of Israel, at a time when his people had experienced violence at the hand of one empire after another. From the first fights between Abraham and the people of the land after Abraham was promised that his descendants would inherit the promised land, to the slavery of the Israelites under Egypt, to coming back to the promised land, the wars between them and the Canaanites who inhabited it, to conquest under the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Seleucids, and now the Romans. Each one of them bringing their own fresh horrors of the people being forced into slavery, into exile, leaders put to death, the temple destroyed. For the nation and for the people of Israel, violence was such a part of their very identity and existence that they had always lived in the shadow of it. And in some ways that violence is written into their legal codes. An idea of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, is about a form of retributive justice that can only and inevitably leads to violent acts. And it's into that context that Jesus is born. And he comes into the world in the shadow of that violence, and his life is marked by it. From Herod learning that the king of the Jews had been born in Bethlehem, and ordering that all the babies born around that time would be killed, to the threats of stoning and corporal punishment that Jesus received later in his life. He experienced and saw the violence of his age firsthand. This was also a time where prophets were springing up out of the ground, would-be messiahs claiming that they would liberate Israel from Rome, that they would rise up and take up arms and overthrow their oppressive imperial leaders. Violence was such a way of life. And Jesus confronted the ultimate expression of it in the crucifixion, in experiencing this torture, in being put to death. He became caught up in that cycle of violence. But I think what is distinct about his story is that he refused to feed into it. That as we heard in that reading, he claims, I can have my Father send a legion of angels, but that is not the fate that is here for me. He chose, he submitted, he sacrificed himself on that cross in order to end the cycle of violence. Instead of responding to the violence of his age and the violence of the crowd and the temple authorities and the Roman imperial authorities, instead of responding to that violence with more violence, more threats, more harsh words, he responded with love, with compassion and understanding, even for those who hung him on a cross. And by doing so sought to end, to break the whole cycle of violence that his people were trapped in, to show them that there was another way. We ourselves are living in the midst of a cycle of violence. Just this week, news broke of yet another school shooting. Yet more innocent children killed. Yet another person who had experienced damage and brokenness in their own life, taking it out on innocent people. It's inescapable. It's all around us. Feels like we lurch from one mass shooting event to another, one school shooting to another, with very little changing, very little happening to give hope that we won't be watching a similar thing on the news in a few weeks, months, or years. We live in a violent age where people of color in particular are afraid for their lives, losing them over nothing at the hands of the state. We live in a violent age where it seems like we're moving from one international or global conflict to another, where more and more is bubbling up all around the world. These cycles are playing out all around us, touching all of our lives in many and various ways. It's hard to find hope for a way out of it. But that is what the cross offers us. Hanging on that cross, Jesus took all of that onto himself. The fullness of the violence of his own age, in order that he might transform it. In order that he might show the people another way, to no longer feed into that cycle of violence, to no longer see it as inevitable, but to believe and to hope in another way. As we face the violence of our own time, the reality of last week's shooting in Nashville, the threat of conflict happening on a global scale, there are concrete steps that we can take, things that we can do to pursue policy change at our local, state, and national levels, to advocate for measures that will stop the chain of violence, that will make weapons more difficult to access, that can provide better mental health resources, or compassionate care for those who are experiencing deep distress and trouble. There are concrete steps that we can take. But more important than all of that, one of the most radical things that we can do in the face of the seemingly never-ending cycle of violence is to have hope. It's to believe that there is another way, that things will not always just be as they have been, but that our world, our society, our hearts, our minds will be transformed. That is what Jesus sought to do on the cross, to offer us a new image of what it means to be human, to be remade more and more into the image and likeness of God, to reflect God's love through the whole of our lives. I think having hope is so central, because at the very fundamental level, if we don't believe that things can be other than they are, if we don't believe that we as a nation, as a society, as a world, as a human species can change, then it's never going to happen. Then there will never be an end to these cycles of violence that we see all around us. Before any substantive change can happen, we have to believe that it can. And that is the hope that Jesus seeks to offer on the cross. And it is the hope that becomes even more real in the resurrection. And the promise that the forces of violence will not have the last word. But that God's love, God's promise of peace, God's promise of hope will have the final say. And so on this Palm Sunday, as we struggle with the story of Jesus' bloody torture and death, and as we enter into this week, into this Holy Week, I pray that we may be people of hope. That we may believe that the cycle of violence cycles of violence that we see all around us will come to an end. That this world will be transformed into the loving image of God's peace. Because without that